Episode 57 CS February 1st, 2025 Solar panels from China and Africa and German vote with AfD help fails. In episode 57 CS, One World solar panels from China and Africa would help grow a smart electrical grid. 2A United States our health in the hands of a man who'd make us sick. 2B reset or purge. Trump EPA dismisses agency science advisors. Critics fear the unusual clean sweep of panels is meant to ease the planned rollback of climate and environmental policy. 2C United States health at his HHS job interview. RFK Jr. stumbles over health policy basics. 3 German opposition gambles with far right on immigration and loses. Friedrich Merz and his Christian Democrats broke a political taboo by working with the hard right alternative for Germany to toughen rules on immigration. It did not pay off. Angela Merkel criticized the move. Musk says Germany has too much of a focus on past guilt. Main content: One World solar panels from China and Africa would help grow a smart electrical grid. The climate solution that doesn't mention climate. Editors note: last week the United Nations climate chief called the global transition away from fossil fuels unstoppable despite the United States' recent turn away from the fight against climate change under President Trump. RAWSEP view: because Africa has access to solar panels and other renewable energy tools at low prices from China. Expanding electrical access in Africa is increasingly possible. Funding for electrical expansion in Africa is being asked for without mentioning that using clean energy networks to power electrical grids will also slow climate change. Excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents. Against would smoke emission Particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Climate Forward. New York Times, January 31st, 2025. This week, top officials from dozens of African countries convened with major international lenders to commit to the biggest rollout of renewable energy in the continent's history. The $35 billion in loans from the World Bank, African Development Bank, and other financial institutions at below-market interest rates are aimed at getting electricity to half of the 600 million Africans without it. About half the money will go toward village-level solar grids. The words climate change were barely uttered at the 2-day summit in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Because of the lack of power, African women are cooking with charcoal inside their houses, and they are dying. How solar power is becoming an unstoppable force in the global energy sector. If you don't have electricity in Africa and are trying to run a business, you most likely burn high-emitting diesel. To run a generator, African leaders argue that they should be allowed to exploit the fossil fuels that they have in abundance, and they are both producing and importing them. 3/4 of grid electricity in Africa is derived from fossil fuels compared to 60% in the US Matipwili community in rural Tanzania, where around 200 houses and businesses briefly got power from a solar mini-grid. Expanding electricity access is one of the surest ways to start strengthening Africa. Exploited economies. Africa's leaders know the developed world is not acting fast enough to enact durable solutions to the climate crisis. Instead, they want investment and development. They want it affordably, and they want it as soon as possible. They want to avoid further instability as population growth remains high. The solar energy industry China built over the past decade, a sector China now completely dominates, has enabled lenders like the World Bank to confidently say at summits like this week's in Tanzania that solar is what will bring Africans energy quickest and at least cost more. Climate fix news: the year in investment. Global investment in low carbon technology hit a record $21 trillion last year. That's an 11% increase over last year. China dominated spending, investing $828 billion in overall, up 23% over 2023. Electrified transport, including electric vehicles, was the biggest investment category with $757 billion spent last year, followed by renewable energy at $728 billion. Electrification heat pumps are outselling gas furnaces in the United States. Again, renewables: for the first time, Europe generated more power from solar than from coal, according to a report from Ember, an energy think tank. EVs, battery-powered cars, are lasting as long as traditional gas and diesel-fueled cars in the UK, according to a study highlighted by The Guardian. In a bid to compete with China, the Europe Union is planning a subsidy for electric vehicles. Energy projects: New York State's biggest solar farm got $950 million in funding. It's expected to be finished in 2026 and could power 120,000 homes. 2A United States our health in the hands of a man who'd make us sick. New York Times opinion. RAWSEP view: another view of the performance of Kennedy Jr. in his Senate hearings this past week. Excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents. Against would smoke emission Particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. New York Times, February 1st, 2025. One of the biggest potential threats to this country is an avian flu pandemic. For bird flu is mutating and spreading to cows and other mammals. If there is a pandemic, then vaccines will be essential. Perhaps the single best thing that President Trump did in his first term was to start Operation Warp Speed, a public-private partnership that accelerated the development of COVID-19 vaccines and saved many lives. What would happen if there were a need for another Operation Warp Speed? But this time the point man on health was suspicious of vaccines, including those that arrested the last pandemic. The coronavirus vaccine is the deadliest vaccine ever made, Kennedy falsely claimed, and in May 2021 he petitioned the government to revoke authorization for it, even though by then the vaccine already had saved 140,000 lives. Kennedy has also claimed that the polio vaccine, one of the great triumphs of the 20th century, may have caused cancers that killed many more people than polio ever did. Kennedy now insists to senators that he is not anti-vaccine and would not discourage their use. Really? In 2021, he said on a podcast that he actively discouraged parents from vaccinating children and urged others to do the same. I see somebody on a hiking trail carrying a little baby, and I say to him, better not get him vaccinated. Kennedy has said that doctors butchered all these children by vaccinating them. The nonprofit that he founded, Children's Health Defense, sells baby onesies with messages such as no vax, no problem. The White House science advisor isn't actually a scientist Trump is pulling out of the World Health Organization, whose global flu surveillance network helps develop flu vaccines, and the administration even directed employees from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention not to email contacts at the World Health Organization. Kennedy's passion for many years has been hostility to vaccines bundled in certitude and nastiness. It is a misguided and dangerous campaign to undermine confidence in vaccines. A woman dies every 2 hours in the United States from cervical cancer, which is almost entirely preventable with HPV vaccinations, yet Kennedy has backed a lawsuit against the maker of the vaccine. The problems go beyond vaccines. Of course, Kennedy suggested darkly that COVID-19 was engineered to spare Chinese people and Ashkenazi Jews. Kennedy doesn't understand our healthcare system. In his hearings, he muddled Medicare and Medicaid. He represents the lowest point of the politicization of science. He is our own Lysenko. I hope senators will protect American kids. From Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to be reset or purge. Trump EPA dismisses agency science advisors. Critics fear the unusual clean sweep of panels is meant to ease the planned rollback of climate and environmental policy. RAWSEP view. This article gives a comprehensive look at where rollbacks of climate and environment policy are aimed. Excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates of 501c3 nonprofit organization. Inside Climate News, January 29, 2025. Federal spending freeze could have widespread impact on environment emergency management. All members of the Environmental Protection Agency's boards of outside advisors on science and clean air were dismissed in a letter emailed late Tuesday. An unusual step the Trump administration said was aimed at depoliticizing the panels. Trump in return was criticized for politicizing the process by eliminating the current independent advisors and clearing the way for them to be replaced with hand-picked appointees. A number of the now dismissed panel members had 2 to 3 years remaining in their terms. It was not immediately clear who would be appointed as replacements on the advisory panels, both of which are required under federal law. Trump's choice to head up the Environmental Protection Agency. Former New York Congressman Lee Zeldin won Senate confirmation on Wednesday, the day after the dismissals. EPA is working to update the Science Advisory Board, SAB, and Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee CASAC to ensure that the agency receives scientific advice consistent with its legal obligations. I was not appointed as a political appointee, but as a scientist that studies air pollution and health, said a professor at Emory University's Rollins School of Public Health who had only begun serving as chair of the CASAC in October. He said the Clean Air Act, passed on a bipartisan basis more than 50 years ago and implemented under administrations of both parties, had been one of the most successful public policies that has ever been enacted globally, in part because of procedures that require the agency to rely on the best science. An engineering professor at Howard University who has served as chair of the Science Advisory Board since 2023 said she was disappointed in the administration's decision. We should not be writing or interpreting science to meet anybody's objectives. We should be independent, doing our best job to evaluate the science as scientists. EPA's 2024 decision to strengthen the national ambient air quality standard for fine particulate matter, for example, was bolstered because it was in line with the advice the agency received from the CASAC. Biden's EPA chief Michael Regan installed a new slate at CASAC when he took office in 2021 based on the findings by the GAO and others that the selection process had become compromised. The Trump administration seemed to be following the conservative policy platform Project 2025, which called for resetting science advisory boards at EPA. The administration seems to be wanting to promote loyalty and compliance with its policy agenda, but that's not the mission of a science advisory board. It's an inappropriate interference in an external independent expert advisory board. 2C United States Health at his HHS job interview. RFK Jr. stumbles over health policy basics. KFF newsletter from San Francisco, California. RAWSEP view. KFF, which was formerly known as the Kaiser Family Foundation or the Henry J. Kaiser Family Foundation, is an American non-profit organization headquartered in San Francisco, California. It prefers KFF, which is its business operating name, to reduce confusion because it is not affiliated with Kaiser Permanente and it is no longer a foundation. KFF states that it is a nonpartisan organization focused on health policy. It conducts its own research, polling, journalism, and specialized public health information campaigns. Its website has been praised for having the most up-to-date and accurate information on health policy and as a must-read for healthcare devotees. Excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates of 501c3 nonprofit organization. KFF Health News newsletter, January 31, 2025. At his HHS job interview, RFK Jr. stumbles over health policy basics. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the anti-vaccine activist President Donald Trump, nominated to lead the nation's top health agency, did little to win over his critics at 2 Senate confirmation hearings this week. Democrats argued he's not qualified for the job, and by botching answers to basic questions about health policy, Kennedy supplied some evidence that he is unqualified. It's uncertain whether Kennedy will get enough votes in the Senate to be confirmed as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Every Democrat and independent is expected to vote against him, meaning he can afford to lose only 3 GOP votes. Bill Cassidy, our law physician who sits on the Finance Committee and chairs the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, known as HELP, is seen as the crucial vote. He made a point of highlighting the successes of vaccination and questioned whether Kennedy, as HHS Secretary, would champion the life-saving medicines he has spent years attacking. Over 3.5 hours at Finance, Kennedy confused Medicare and Medicaid, the 2 largest government health insurance programs, which together cover more than a third of Americans, but operate very differently. He also mistakenly said that Medicaid is funded solely by the federal government. In fact, nearly a third of costs are paid by the states. Kennedy said he didn't think HHS had a law enforcement branch. The agency can issue fines and penalties against health providers who break the law. He didn't do much better Thursday at HELP, where he couldn't correctly answer a question from Sin Maggie Hassan DNH about how Medicare works. Kennedy got kid glove treatment from most Republicans on both Senate panels, but Cassidy was an exception at the finance hearing. He unsuccessfully pressed Kennedy to say how he would improve care for people enrolled in Medicare and Medicaid, often called dual eligibles. Opening the HELP hearing, Cassidy made clear to Kennedy that he supports vaccines and that he expects the U.S. Health Secretary to support them as well, yet he couldn't persuade the nominee to disavow debunked conspiracies that childhood vaccines cause autism. The Finance Committee plans a vote next week. HELP does not vote on HHS nominees. At the close of Thursday's hearing, Cassidy said he would take the weekend to consider his vote. Will you continue what you have been, or will you overturn a new leaf at age 70? Cassidy said the Trump administration's second week has been even more disruptive than its first, with an on-again, off-again funding freeze that left many scrambling to understand what was going on. A sweeping Trump administration order threw the nation's health system into disarray Tuesday as states and the health industry tried to make sense of what looked like a freeze on federal Medicaid funding. Public health. Trump administration's halt of CDC's weekly scientific report stalls bird flu studies. An unprecedented freeze on the agency's morbidity and mortality weekly report sparks new concerns about political meddling in science. Led by RFK Jr., conservatives embrace raw milk. Regulators say it's dangerous. For now, the CDC still recommends against consuming raw milk, and the FDA bans its interstate sale. Children's health schools panels aren't as plugged in as they should be to kids' diabetes tech parents. Say with continuous glucose monitor students with type 1 diabetes no longer have to visit the school nurse for a finger prick, but some parents say it falls to them to keep an eye on blood sugar levels from home or work, even though they may not be able to quickly reach their child when something's wrong. Stable housing is scarce for a rapidly increasing number of homeless seniors, and insurers sometimes deny coverage for prosthetic limbs by deeming them experimental or not medically necessary. Reporter assesses rise in vaccine exemptions letters to the editor. Readers offer their takes on the family doctor shortage and vaccine policies. KFF Health News gives readers a chance to comment on a recent batch of stories. Would you like to comment on a story? Please visit our letter to the editor. Form 3. German opposition gambles with far right on immigration and loses. Friedrich Merz and his Christian Democrats broke a political taboo by working with the hard right Alternative for Germany to toughen rules on immigration. It did not pay off. Angela Merkel criticized the move. Musk says Germany has too much of a focus on past guilt. RAWSEP view the Germano-Nazi Party. AfD in Germany broke a firewall and was included in an alliance vote attempt, which failed with the German Conservative Christian Democratic Union CDU by CDU head Friedrich Merz ahead of the German February 2025 snap elections, which Friedrich Merz hopes to win the failed vote after allowing the firewall against neo-Nazis to fall slightly weakens Merz's chances for winning. The AfD exchanged hugs after participating with the CDU, albeit for a failed vote attempt. RAWSEP top excerpts from the article below. It left Mr. Merz facing fierce criticism from political opponents, religious leaders, Holocaust survivors, and former Chancellor Angela Merkel, who remains a member of Mr. Merz's party. Tens of thousands demonstrated outside of conservative Christian Democrats' party offices across the country. The following day, Ms. Merkel made a rare public comment decrying Mr. Merz's reliance on a party that winks at Nazi slogans, and which many, including the domestic intelligence services, consider a threat to the country's constitution. I believe it is wrong, Ms. Merkel said in a statement, to knowingly enable a majority in the German Bundestag to vote with the AfD for the first time. Others did too. Albrecht Weinberg, a 99-year-old Holocaust survivor, announced that he would be returning a medal bestowed on him in 2017. For years, mainstream parties had refused to work with the far right, even as the AfD won a growing share of votes in national elections. Mainstream party leaders assured Germans that the party would be kept out of government. Mr. Merz's political maneuver was designed to recapture voters who have drifted to the hard right, but for now it appears to have backfired, with the AfD seeming to be the only clear winner in the affair when the measure passed on Wednesday by a razor-thin victory, with several members of Mr. Merz's party abstaining. AfD party leaders cheered, they exchanged hugs, and took a group selfie on the parliament floor. Mr. Merz sat just feet away looking glum, a gloating Alice Weidel, the AfD's chancellor candidate, told reporters afterward that Wednesday's vote showed it was possible that the elections could produce a governing majority in parliament if the far right and the conservatives worked together. Excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. New York Times, January 31st, 2025. The man who has been heavily favored to become Germany's next chancellor took an extraordinary gamble this week, both for his political future and his country's long-standing firewall against political extremism. It did not go as he hoped in an effort to portray himself and his party as tough on immigration. Friedrich Merz, the leader of the poll-leading Christian Democrats, pushed a series of measures tightening borders and accelerating deportations through parliament this week. He did so with help from the hard-right Alternative for Germany party, or AfD, parts of which have been classified as extremist by German intelligence agencies. On Friday, the gambit ended in a crushing legislative defeat for Mr. Merz, dissent in his own party, and jubilant claims of new legitimacy from the AfD, a chain reaction that could rattle Mr. Merz's comfortable seat at the top of the polls. Mr. Merz's willingness to rely on support from the AfD broke a taboo in German politics that had endured since the end of World War II. Mr. Merz insisted on a vote which he lost by a narrow margin of 11 votes. In effect, he doubled down, stepping back from a call he had made in November after Mr. Scholz's three-party coalition collapsed for mainstream parties to avoid working with the far right to pass legislation. One question now is whether Mr. Merz can reunite his fractured coalition. Another is whether, if he becomes chancellor, he might go even further in allowing collaboration between conservatives and far right. Several lawmakers this week evoked Austria, where a governing coalition between the hard right Freedom Party and the center-right Austrian People's Party now looks likely. It would be the first time the far right ran a governing coalition, though it had been a minority partner before. Mr. Merz continues to say he will not entertain such a coalition. Germany's election campaign. Germany's likely leader flirts with a taboo, working with the far right. January 27, 2025.